Okay. So we are looking at the history of England, English literature from 1485 to Shakespeare's time. It's not exactly 1564. We'll be talking, our talk will cover a little bit of the next century as well. But this slide, we will quickly take a glance at what happened between 1485 and 1564. In 1485, you had the Battle of Bosworth. You will remember, Battle of Bosworth marked the end of the Wars of the Roses. And a king was killed in the battlefield. His name was Richard III. And the victorious person in that battle was a man named Henry Richmond. And Henry Richmond is popularly known as the first Tudor king. And the first Tudor king is this gentleman here in the corner. I hope you can see him. He is known as Henry VII. In the battle, he was Henry Richmond, and in history, we call him Henry VII. In Shakespeare's play titled Richard III, you will find him crowning, people crowning him on the battlefield itself. In the battlefield of Bosworth itself, the crown of England is placed on his head, and later a formal coronation happens, and he became the King of England under the title Henry VII. And Henry ruled from 1485 to 1509. He was a very able king. He was not only good at the battlefield, he was also a very good administrator, and he managed things very well. And see, the image itself shows him as a kind of, what shall we say, a very scholarly person. So he consolidated the country, made the country, the economy very strong. He ruled with an iron fist. Don't think these people were very gentle monarchs. They were very brutal people, and those days were very harsh, and the rule was also very harsh. And the first Tudor king, this gentleman, I haven't written his name here. His name is Henry VII. After he died, his son Henry, again another Henry, he is known in history as Henry VIII. This picture you have, this man standing here, is Henry VIII, a very interesting and very notorious historical character, one of the most powerful rulers of England, and also a much hated ruler when he was ruling. And he is popular as a very brutal person. And it is believed that by middle age he became affected by some disease, psychological disease. Could be due to some injuries he had, or it could be due to some disease like syphilis. We do not know. And that is Henry VIII. He came after Henry VII. Henry VIII was a very strong ruler, as I said, and he, what shall we say, made again the country very strong. And some very interesting things happened during his time, which we will discuss in the next slide. So that is Henry VIII. After he died, his son Edward, he had 6 wives. He married 6 times. That story also I'll tell you in the next slide. And soon after, he had only one son, and the name of his son was Edward. He was coronated as Edward VII. And Edward lived only for a short while. He passed away. And then Mary the First, you have the picture here of Mary, a very stern-looking woman, came to power in 1558. Look at the dates. Now, see why you are looking at the history of England is not because you will be asked questions. It is because the things you study are closely related to the history of the nation, particularly Shakespeare and his time. You must know the historical background to understand the works written in those days better. That is why we are looking at the history of England as well. Right. So Edward was the only surviving son of Henry. And when Edward died after a few years, he was a boy when he became the king, and he died a few years afterwards. And his sister Mary was Henry's daughter by his first wife, Catherine, and Mary became the ruler of England. Mary was a very stern ruler, very difficult lady, but luckily for England, she also ruled only for a few years. So she came to throne in 1558. These years are the years of kingship, not their lifetime. 1558, and she passed away in 1603. So that is Mary the First of England. She was a very brutal queen. And to tell the history is Edward wanted to have a divorce, and therefore he broke with the Catholic Church. As we know from the previous classes, England was at that time Roman Catholic in religion, and Pope had absolute control over the country, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the main bishop of England, followed the orders of the Pope more than the orders of the king. And when during the reign of Henry, when Henry wanted a divorce from his first wife was Catherine of Aragon, and he wanted to marry another woman named Anne Boleyn, and he would not get a divorce, so he broke with the church. So in the history of England, from its very beginning, from its days of Christianization up to the Tudor period, this is a very, very important event when Henry broke with the church, and that led to what is called the English Reformation. That is, Reformation were reforms in the church, and the English Reformation took place during the reign of Henry, and it was due to a personal reason. He wanted divorce, and Catholic Church did not allow divorce. So he married the second woman, that is Anne Boleyn, and he had a child by her. It was another daughter. Her name was Elizabeth. And then he went on to marry. He married total 6 times. And Edward was the son of his third wife. Her name was Jane Seymour. That is the more stories in the next slide. And but Edward was short-lived. Mary was short-lived. And Mary tried to bring back Catholicism into England. So she did not want to follow her father's policy of Protestantism. Protestantism, it was a new church created by Henry, and totally opposing the Pope. And Mary did not want to follow it. She wanted to bring back Catholicism. So Mary's reign was very brutal. She had many Protestants killed, and it was a bloody time. And in history, Mary is sometimes known as Bloody Mary. And after Mary died, as strangely as fate would have it, the daughter by Anne Boleyn, Anne was the second wife of Henry, and Henry had her beheaded later because he wanted to marry again. So the second wife of Henry, who was beheaded, had a child named Elizabeth. Nobody thought Elizabeth would do anything worthwhile in her life, but when Mary died in 1603, Queen Elizabeth became the monarch of England. So I haven't put up a picture of Elizabeth. I should have, but no, you can always check up. Now this is the story of Henry and his 6 wives. His first wife was Catherine, whom he divorced. Then second wife was Anne Boleyn, who he had beheaded. Her head was cut off. And Anne's daughter was Elizabeth. Catherine's daughter was Mary. And the third wife was Jane. Jane gave birth to Edward, but Jane died of natural causes. Then Anne of Cleves. He married another Anne. Her name. This was Anne Boleyn, and this is Anne of Cleves. And this Anne was divorced. So divorced, murdered, died, divorced, and then he married another lady named Catherine Howard, who also was beheaded. And later he married another Catherine, her name was Catherine Parr, who went on to live even after he died. So when Henry died, his wife was this Catherine, last Catherine. So the first wife was a Catherine, last wife of a Catherine. Very interesting story it would be. See, two Catherines, two Annes, one Jane, two divorced. Catherine was divorced, Anne was divorced. Catherine, the Anne and second Catherine were beheaded. So very complicated, very interesting time. You can imagine what brutal times those were. So Henry brought in Reformation. Reformation was changes within the church. He declared that he was the head of the church. He declared himself as the head of the church, and the Anglican church became a Protestant. So you must remember that Protestantism began in Europe. The first major break with the Catholic Church happened in Germany with Martin Luther. So that church is called the Lutheran Church today. That's also a Protestant church. And in England, the break with the church was because the king wanted a divorce, and that led to the establishment of a new church. And the king became the supreme head of the church. And the king would appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury as usual, but the Archbishop will be controlled by the king. You'll remember that Henry II was not able to control the Archbishop of Canterbury. And then Henry went on to destroy the monasteries. He went on to destroy all the nunneries and monasteries of England. And the other day we told the story of how the dead body, the tomb of Henry II was inside the Cathedral of Canterbury. And during the reign of Henry VIII, he sent people to destroy or plunder all the monasteries. The monasteries held immense wealth, and he sent his soldiers all over England, who plundered, who all the wealth from different cathedrals, and many cathedrals were destroyed. And all these happened in the 16th century, in the early half of 16th century. And in England, even today, you will find many of these ruins, including the Tintern Abbey, which there is a famous poem named Tintern Abbey Lines, written by William Wordsworth. You might have heard of it. Even Tintern Abbey is today in ruins. You can see the ruins of Tintern Abbey. And all these damage was done during the reign of Henry VIII. The Whitby Cathedral, many cathedrals. And in near Canterbury Cathedral, there was a big monastery called the St. Augustine's Monastery, which was also destroyed. And it is said that people carted to the royal treasury 7 carts full of gold, silver, and precious stones like that. So you can imagine that Henry became very, very rich by plundering the monasteries. And what happened to St. Thomas Becket's tomb in the Canterbury Cathedral was that Henry's men dug up the bones of Thomas Becket and threw them away. So inside the Cathedral of Canterbury, where the pilgrims often went, today the bones of Thomas Becket is not there. Well, that is as a matter of interest I was telling you. So for those who are wondering why I am telling you history, I am telling you history because the historical references, all the information I am giving you now, will repeatedly occur in many of the works you are going to study. So this knowledge will be of help to you. So those are the things done by Henry VIII. And as I said, Henry was followed by two of his children, but they ruled for a short time, and then came Queen Elizabeth. So in this slide, I have written Protestantism versus Catholicism. So with Henry, inside England, there was a lot of problem between the Protestants and the Catholics, and it continues even today in a little measure, I can say. But in many times, all these things became very severe, and there was a lot of bloodshed. Many people were killed. Mary, for example, had many important Protestant bishops and other officials burned on the stake. So Henry was Protestant, his daughter Mary was Catholic, and then came, so she is called Bloody Mary, and Mary was followed by the very diplomatic Elizabeth I. She is known as the Virgin Queen in history because she never got married. So there are many countries, many products, many establishments with the name Virgin, Virginia, etc. And most of them are a reference to Elizabeth I. So Queen Elizabeth was very diplomatic. But it is believed that she never married because if she married, she had to marry either a Protestant or a Catholic, and that would create problem in the country. Therefore, she never married. That could be, but that need not be the reason. There may be other reasons as well. So Elizabeth was able to establish some kind of peace in the country. She ruled with an iron fist, just like her father. She was a very strong and powerful monarch, and she did not unleash terror on the people. She did not just have people murdered, but many people suffered under her too, because she did not try to suppress Catholicism, but she tried to control it. She did not encourage people to be Catholic. So if you want to be a Catholic, you wanted to pay a big fine to the king. So such things were there. There are many questions about whether Shakespeare was a Catholic and whether Shakespeare's father became a Catholic at some point, and if that was the reason why he lost his fortune. Many discussions are there. So she came to power in 1558. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Look at this slide. I have not put a picture of Mary. This is the picture of Elizabeth. Again, the very stern-looking face of Elizabeth. So I said this was Mary. I'm sorry. I had not put up a picture of Mary and Edward. This is Elizabeth herself, who ruled from 1558. The year that Mary died, and she went on to rule till 1603. So she led the country for the entire second half of the 16th century. This is Elizabeth. Her face, in those days, I told you, broad forehead was fashionable, and you see the hair. You can't believe the hair of people of those days. It could very well be a wig. Okay, this is Elizabeth. I was saying that Elizabeth came to power in 1558, and in the year 1587, she took a stern action against her cousin, Mary. So Mary of Scots, this is not the Mary we talked about a while ago, Bloody Mary. She is already dead. That Mary is Elizabeth's sister, half-sister. This is a cousin, Mary, and she is known as Mary of Scots. She was the Queen Mother of Scotland. Scotland was at that time almost independent country. So Mary was such a troublesome person that she was a Catholic, and she tried to get rid of Elizabeth and become the ruler of England many times. You must remember that during the reign of Elizabeth, this lady here, during the reign of Elizabeth, there were many attempts at her life. So she lived under constant fear of getting killed. Particularly, these conspiracies were hatched by Catholics in Europe and with people, supporters inside England. So Mary of Scots also was involved, and Elizabeth had her beheaded. So this is an interesting historical fact. Mary of Scots herself is a very interesting character, and she lost her head. And it is a spectacular kind of thing, because in those days the important people were beheaded. So if you get your head cut off, if you do a crime and have your head cut off, you are considered very lucky, because only the elite and very respectable people had that punishment. Other people, ordinary people, were killed in a much more brutal fashion. They were hanged, drawn and quartered, it is said. Hanged, drawn and quartered. This is something we should keep in mind. As I was saying, it was brutal times. So if you are what happens in hanging, drawing, and quartered is a person, and the beheading happened in private. So, for example, Anne Boleyn was beheaded, Catherine Howard was beheaded. No, those were the queens of Henry VIII. And Henry VIII had many other important people killed, including Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia. He also was beheaded. Mary of Scots was beheaded. All these would happen within the Tower of London or some enclosed space in the presence of a limited number of people. But there were regular hangings happening in London and in other towns every day almost. So this would be in the marketplace or on a high place where people would come and gather. So hanging was a public event in those days. So people would come and gather there will be a high scaffold. The criminal or the person who is guilty will be brought. He will be hanged first. So all the people will be able to see this. And the executioner was a entertainer also. He would hang the person, and before the person died, they would cut the man down, and he will be displayed on a ladder-like structure so everybody can see. And very often the executioner would perform elaborate procedures on the person. What they would do is they would cut open the chest, maybe draw out the heart. That will happen in the end, because once the heart is taken out, the man will die. Before that, the executioner will cut open his stomach, his or her stomach, and the entrails will be displayed to the people. It is very gruesome. You can't imagine that in modern days, but in the times, even during Shakespeare's time, such things were happening. But it was more common in the Middle Ages. So hanging, drawing is cutting open the stomach, and then the body will be cut into 4 pieces. That is quartering, and displayed in different parts of the town so that people will not repeat the crime. And the head very often was kept on a pillar on the side of the London Bridge. We studied, we had a reference to London Bridge in the previous class. So that was the way in which people. So when you were going to the market and cross the London Bridge, you might see heads looking at you from either side. So all those things were there. So Mary of Scots. So when we hear that somebody was beheaded, you should actually feel happy, because that's a very comfortable thing. Normally, you die very quickly, but in the hanging, drawing, quarterly, you suffer immense untold misery. But again, about the beheading, these executioners very often were clumsy people, and they were drunk sometimes. And even if they can, cut off the head with a single stroke of the axe, executioners cut people's head using axes. They often bungled, and sometimes it took 2 or 3 times to cut off a person's head. So it is believed that Mary of Scots was beheaded with, the executioner had to cut thrice to have her head removed. It's not because her neck was very thick, it is because the executioner was a clumsy person. And you must also remember that when Anne Boleyn was beheaded, the king, because she was his wife, brought a swordsman from France to cut her head off. He could not put up with the idea of her head being cut off by a executioner with an axe. So he had a special expert a swordsman brought in from France. These are all interesting bits of history that from those days. About Spanish Armada that I have written here, that Spanish Armada was the naval fleet of Spain. So Spain was a strong Catholic country, and a while after Mary was beheaded, there was a lot of protest in Europe, and Spain decided to attack, conquer, and Catholicize England. Their idea was to come to England, maybe capture it, kill Elizabeth, and take over rule, and make England again a Catholic country. And so they sent a huge army, huge naval fleet with very large number of ships. But English Navy was, even though the number of ships were less, was much more skilled and much more well designed. So they were able to destroy the Spanish Armada in 1588. So it's a very historic event, and which marked the naval superiority of England over the other countries of Europe. And indirectly, you can say that had an impact on our history because England became a supreme power at that time, and a few decades later, they set up this English East India Company, and started the reign of colonization. India gradually became part of the British Empire, and many other parts of the world became part of the British Empire due to these things. The plundering of the monasteries made the king very rich, and we had stable government, and Elizabeth was a very strong administrator, and she won this naval supremacy, which led to geographical discoveries, which led to colonization, and all those things in history. So come to English drama, the origin of English drama. I'm not sure if we discuss the miracle mystery plays. In the Middle Ages itself, there was a kind of drama in England. So in the Middle Ages, you look at this picture, you have a stage here. You can see it is a cart actually. This is a cart, a movable thing. You can see the wheel underneath. So this is a movable stage. So in the Middle Ages, there were these miracle and mystery plays which continued in Shakespeare's time. And even today in England, they keep that tradition to a little extent. They enact that. But in those days, this was systematically done. Because in the church, the priest would use the Latin language, read the Bible in the Latin language and give sermons in English often. But people were not able to read the Bible because Bible was was never in English. It was either in Greek or Latin, and only the clergymen were able to read it. So the ordinary people did not know the stories of the Bible, and therefore these stories were enacted on the stage. So mystery plays were the stories depicting the lives of Christ, and miracle plays were plays depicting the life of Christ, different events in the life of Christ. These are overlapping words. Both miracle and mystery plays are overlapping, and sometimes people use interchangeably. So you generally just remember this: miracle and mystery plays depicted the life of Christ, and also later on the life of the saints. Initially it was the life of Christ. So what will happen is, one cart like this, which will be sponsored by one trade guild, will go to a town, and they will present one part of Christ's life, maybe from his childhood up to youth. That will be displayed, how the birth of Christ was announced and all that. So that will be shown. So this cart will remain in that village for a few days, and they will enact the scene. And then they will move the cart to the next town, and another cart will come in with the next scene. So that is how these drama were enacted in England, miracle mystery plays. And then there were, after another kind of play was the life of saints and their miracles, etc. So those were also showed. And these were early forms of drama in England. So England had its own traditional dramatic form, which is in these miracle and mystery plays. So what I'm saying is that even though the influence of Greek and Roman models were there, England had its own tradition of drama. So Senecan Influences, there was an Italian dramatist named Seneca, who wrote very tragic kind of plays. They were very bitter. Vengeance or revenge was often the theme. And the play Hamlet, which you will be looking at next weekend, is in the Senecan tradition, though it is highly, it is a very unique kind of play because of the genius who wrote it. So Seneca was an influence. Seneca was a Roman or Italian playwright. So in England, the first tragedy to be created was Ralph Roister Doister, which happened before Shakespeare. And the first tragedy was uh, Gobudak, which was again written in the Senecan tradition. But the French, the German, not German, the Greek plays on which the Italians modeled their, Seneca modeled his plays, were written according to certain rules. The unities of time, place, and action, things like that, which if you do not know, I will explain in a while. But Shakespeare and the English writers did not keep these rules very often. Shakespeare particularly did not keep these rules very strictly. So we can say that the plays of Shakespeare and the plays written in England during the Elizabethan times were largely English in character. So the time that we are talking about, the year in which Shakespeare was born was 1564, when Queen Elizabeth was ruling England. And I am again preparing the background for the Shakespearean writers. So autocracy monarchy was in the vogue. The king was ruled, and he or she ruled almost according to her or his own will. The parliament was not very strong, though it was there. So it was largely an autocratic rule. So nobody in the country was secure. Today we have the protection of the law, the judicial system. In those days, the judicial system was very poor, and people could lose their life. They could have their ears cut off. They could have their heads cut off. They could be hanged, drawn, and quartered. They could be, sent to the prison. They could be imprisoned for very minor things. Their land could be confiscated. So people lived in very, very troubled times in those days. Freedom was very limited, and there were plagues, particularly in the literal sense of the disease plague, Pastularensis pestis, the virus that causes plague. There were three strands: bubonic, pneumonic, and another variety. But bubonic plague was more common in England, which was a very unbearable disease. You contract it, and in a few days you die. So there is this ringer roses nursery rhyme, pocket full of posies, Asha, Usha, we all fall down. The story that people learn in the nursery school is about the bubonic plague. So when you have plague, you will have rings of roses on your skin, because there will be hemorrhage under the skin. Initially it will be rose, and then it will be black. So we call it black death. And bubobs will form on your armpit, your groin, etc. Large pustules, large abscesses will form, and people will suffer a lot, and they will die. So plagues were there, and plague broke out in London very often. And whenever plague broke out, there was a lockdown, just like we had lockdown, and still we are going through a similar situation right now. Now in Kerala, theatres are opened, but in London there were times when the theatres remained closed for nearly 2 years. So you can imagine Shakespeare living in London, writing and working, living by the theatre, and the theatre gets closed, and it is believed that he would go home to Stratford whenever the theatres closed. So the lockdown thing was a common phenomenon in those days, and people suffered so many other diseases as well. Many diseases for which they did not even know the names of: sleeping sickness, sweating sickness, typhoid fever, cancers of various kinds, and even an ordinary disease like a very bad teeth can kill you, because there were no antibiotics. The life was very unhygienic, and people did not have any idea about the presence of bacteria, things like that. They never washed their hands. They never had any concept of hygiene. So people died in large numbers. So it is believed that I read somewhere recently that the biggest achievement of Shakespeare is not writing all the plays. It is that he survived the first year in his life, which was something that very rarely happened in England in those days. So those were the days, and you could be robbed, you could be attacked. There were a lot of violence. There were fights, street fights. The contemporary of Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, whose Faustus you studied the previous day. Christopher Marlowe was involved in a fight in which he killed somebody, and later on he was involved in another fight in which he got killed. So Marlowe died in a brawl, in a in a pub. See, in those days, that could happen at any time. People could kill you, people could get killed, and not much justice involved. Justice was not very fair all the time. So London at that time was again a stinking kind of place. It was one of the biggest cities of the world at that time. It was also a very dirty, unhygienic kind of place. Okay, that is about London of Shakespeare's time. And you might want to know where Shakespeare was born. Shakespeare was born, and this is the Avon River in Stratford, the photograph. He was born in Stratford. There are many places called Stratford, and there are many places called Avon, many rivers called Avon, but Stratford upon Avon is only one. The town of Stratford on the shore of the river Avon is where Shakespeare was born. And in this map, you can see, you see Canterbury here. We talked about Canterbury in the other class. This is the English Channel, which the French people would cross over because this is French side. And see, Canterbury and London are almost in a straight line, and there was Roman roads leading from Canterbury to London. And Shakespeare, Stratford is something like 105 miles from there, maybe by kilometers, 130 kilometers from London to Stratford. So if you travel by train, it will take you about 2 hours to reach there, or maybe 1 hour and a half. So that is Stratford. And if you drive or go by train from London, you will pass Oxford on the way to Stratford. So you see, Oxford is on the way. So when people take arranged tours, the bus will take you to Oxford and then to Stratford and then bring you back. And this is Cambridge. See, this is Oxford and this is Cambridge. And this is where Shakespeare was born. And Shakespeare did not go either to Oxford nor to Cambridge. That is the interesting thing about Shakespeare. Okay, now London to Shakespeare. I just wanted you to know, because Shakespeare was born in Stratford in the year 1564, in the month of April it is believed, because we have records. It's very interesting because all this is more than 500 years ago, but in England you still have records of those things. Though much of the records have been lost, in England you still have a lot of records. Unbelievable. In the London archives, you have documents which are very, very old. So we know that from the church records in Stratford that Shakespeare was baptized on a particular day, and we believe that he was born a couple of days before that. I'm avoiding dates so that I won't confuse you. So we know that Shakespeare was born in 1564, and we also know that he died in April in 1616. So the year 2016, 4 years back, was the 500th death anniversary year of Shakespeare. And the School of Distance Education conducted a special seminar to celebrate that. So that is, we are now, we have seen Shakespeare. It's more than 500 years since Shakespeare died. What more about Shakespeare? Yeah, he was born in Stratford. He was born in a rich family. His father was John Shakespeare, who was a wealthy merchant. He dealt in gloves, leather goods, etc., shoes and things like that. His mother was a woman named Mary Arden, and Shakespeare had many sisters and brothers. And he went to a school in the neighborhood, because all the people who could afford it sent their children to the local school. And the local schools were called the grammar schools. So it's very likely that Shakespeare went to the grammar school with other boys, and he learned grammar. What grammar is it? It is Latin. So the grammar schools taught mostly Latin language. So don't think that Shakespeare went to the nursery or the school and studied English nursery rhymes. He did not, because in those days English was not taught in any schools in England. Can you believe that? Yeah. So in the schools in England, Latin and Greek were taught. So we do not have records, but we believe that Shakespeare did learn some Latin and had a reasonably good education in the school. But we don't have any evidence that he went either to Oxford or Cambridge. So Shakespeare probably did not have higher education as we call it today. And the thing about Shakespeare is that we know very little about Shakespeare's life. Though there is a lot of things said about Shakespeare, there are simply thousands and thousands of books about Shakespeare. Perhaps Shakespeare is one of the person and about whom the maximum number of books have been written, after perhaps the Bible. The maximum number of books have been written on Shakespeare and his plays. And if you go to the catalogs of the Library of Congress in US or any big library, you will find that there's an immense number of books written on Shakespeare. But interestingly, we know very, very little about Shakespeare. And Shakespeare scholarship is a big topic. വളരെ കൗതുകമുള്ള കാര്യം എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ഈ ലണ്ടൻ ആർക്കൈവ്സ് പോലത്തെ സ്ഥലങ്ങളിലൊക്കെ ആയിരക്കണക്കിന് പേജസ് ഉണ്ട് ആ കാലത്തെ ഷേക്സ്പിയർ ജീവിച്ചിരുന്ന ആ കാലത്തുള്ള പലതരത്തിലുള്ള ഡോക്യുമെൻറ്റ്സ്, ലീഗൽ ഡോക്യുമെൻറ്റ്സ്, മാരേജ് ഡോക്യുമെൻറ്റ്സ്, കേസസ്, then registration of land, property, etc., taxes, all those documents. അങ്ങനെ millions of pages ആണ് അവിടെ ഒക്കെ സൂക്ഷിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളത്. And there are people who have gone through every single line in these archives over the last few centuries. ഓരോ വരിയായിട്ട് നോക്കി അവിടെ എവിടെയെങ്കിലുമൊക്കെ ഷേക്സ്പിയറിനെ കുറിച്ച് എന്തെങ്കിലും പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടോ എന്ന് നിരന്തരം ഗവേഷണം നടത്തുന്ന ഷേക്സ്പിയർ സ്കോളേഴ്സ് ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ ഇന്ന് ഷേക്സ്പിയറിനെ കുറിച്ച് ഇനി അറിയാനൊന്നുമില്ല, വളരെ കുറച്ച് നമുക്കിപ്പോഴും അറിയാവൂ. We don't have any document that is written in Shakespeare's hand. We have Shakespeare's signature in 6 places, which he in his own handwriting, but all the 6 times Shakespeare has spelled his name differently. That's an interesting thing. So Shakespeare himself did not spell his name uniformly. In those days, spelling was not given a lot of importance. And it is believed that Shakespeare had a very bad handwriting. We do not know. Okay, let us see what is in the next slide. Yeah, this is a WhatsApp message that was going around for the last few years, in fact. I myself got it several times. I will read it. Shakespeare's mother said to him, "You are very weak in English. If you fail this time, I will not let you continue your studies." Then it goes on to say, Shakespeare did not pass MA English, and now no one can pass MA English without reading Shakespeare. This is basically a lot of nonsense, but I have written it. I've written it here so that we can have a discussion about certain things. One, there are many things in the social media saying Shakespeare said this, Shakespeare said that. Most of them are not by Shakespeare. So whenever you feel like forwarding a quotation by Shakespeare, please check in the internet and see if those words were actually from Shakespeare. Very often it is some nonsense somebody has written and said that it is written by Shakespeare, because Shakespeare has become a kind of authority of English language and literature, which is very, very tricky. Here Shakespeare's mother said to him is very unlikely, because Mary Arden was an illiterate woman. Just like any other woman in those days, she was not literate. And she very evidently was not most likely not very much worried about his son's education, because she had so many other things to do in her household. And again, you are very weak in English. As I told you that in those days, nobody worried whether you were weak in English or not. People were worried about Latin and Greek, because education was the study of Latin and Greek. And English came to be taught in England only in the 19th century or so. Definitely not in the 16th century. So nobody would be worried whether you are weak in English. So that statement is not likely at all. Okay? And the education in those days probably was not like it is now. So no mother would perhaps say in those days, you are weak in this and you will not continue your studies, etc. But the other thing is true. Shakespeare probably never took a formal degree, and it's true that so many people in the world have Shakespeare for their MA. But this statement is again wrong. No one can pass MA English without reading Shakespeare is not very much right, because across the world there are programs offered, MA programs offered in cultural studies and literature without touching Shakespeare directly. So today, Shakespeare is not as held as an immense literary figure as he used to be maybe 50 years ago. So many other interests have come into the area of literary studies, and things are changing. So you can take your MA without reading Shakespeare. It is possible, but not in Kerala University, but it is possible. Even inside India, there are universities where you can opt not to have Shakespeare. But but one important thing is Shakespeare is very, very significant in the history of English language and literature. One second, yeah, very, very important, because the very language of English has drawn a lot from Shakespeare. Many things that Shakespeare wrote has become part of the English language. Many expressions, so many expressions, many English words would not have been there if Shakespeare was not writing, because he preserved many words which would have otherwise died, and he also used many words afresh. He created his own words. So all these are proved through Shakespearean studies over the period of time. And we don't have a clear picture of Shakespeare. This is one of the pictures that we have. We are. It is believed that there are 3 pictures that exist of Shakespeare, created either during his time or a little after his time. And this is one engraving, and there is another one above Shakespeare's grave in Stratford-upon-Avon. Shakespeare is buried in the church in Stratford-upon-Avon, but there is a memorial built inside the Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner, where all the other English poets are. Most others are. Okay. Now, let's look at Shakespeare's life. Shakespeare's father was John and mother was Mary, as I said. He had 7 brothers and sisters. He probably went to a grammar school from 7 to 13. We don't have evidence, but we believe that is the case. In 1582, when he was only 18 years old, he married a young lady named Anne Hathaway. And, she was 8 years, 6 to 8 years. I forgot exactly how older she was. But I think she was about 8 years older than Shakespeare. And she was pregnant at the time of marriage. So these things today might look funny, that a man is marrying a woman 8 years older than him, and she is pregnant at the time of these were all very common things in those days. So we need not make any other inferences based on this. So married at the age of 18. The lady was Anne Hathaway. They had many children. One of his sons was named Hamnet, not Hamlet, but Hamnet, and Hamnet died young. And none of Shakespeare's children lived for long. Some of his daughters lived, married, had children, but there are no important people remaining in Shakespeare's line today. So we from the church records we know that he married an Anne Hathaway, and we know she is senior from her grave, where the year of her death is written. So we know that she is older than her, and she died after Shakespeare did. Okay. So he was born in Stratford. He was in Stratford, but from about 1583, that is a year after he got married, up to 1592, we have absolutely no evidence about what Shakespeare was doing. So those years are called the lost years in Shakespeare's life. We do not know what he was doing in those years. But again, we know that he got married in 82, and some of his children, the baptism details we have of his children. But we know that by 1592, he was already well established in London as an actor, as a playwright, and also as a person who owned shares in the theatres of those days. So that is the interesting thing about Shakespeare's life. We know much less about his life. Can't hear anything. Can't hear anything. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So those people who cannot hear, there is some problem with your microphone. Your speakers. Thank you. Yes. Okay, we'll continue. So he married Anne Hathaway, and then he went to London and established himself in London. So by 92, he had already established himself, but we do not know, what he did in between. There are so many theories about what Shakespeare did from 83 to 92. But those are mostly theories. And then in 1592 we have a few references to Shakespeare. There is this Robert Greene, another playwright who was already in London when Shakespeare went there. In one of his pamphlets complains about Shakespeare that he is an upstart crow beautified with our feathers. So we know it is about Shakespeare because there's a reference to shake scene, and also a line which is from Shakespeare's Henry VI, I think. So Green's reference to, Green was a university wit. Green, Peel, Nash, Marlowe, all those people are called the university wits. I think already that reference would have come yesterday. He was a university wit. Thomas Kidd was a university wit. They are called university wits, are lodged too. Yes. They were called university wits because they were wit in the sense, people having wisdom. They all wrote poetry, they wrote drama, and they all had education in the universities. But then suddenly this Shakespeare comes, who did not apparently have a university background, and he became a very successful playwright and a theatre owner, and naturally all these men were upset. And Greene, towards his last days, he wrote a pamphlet called The Grot Worth of Wit, in which he refers to Shakespeare as an upstart crow beautified with our feathers. And then later, Greene died soon, and Kidd died, and Marlowe died. Everybody died very young. And when Shakespeare was only kind of maturing, all these competitors passed away, and Shakespeare filled that scene as a very powerful, notable figure. And after a while, then Ben Jonson comes in. Ben Jonson is a contemporary of William Shakespeare, who complained that Shakespeare knew small Latin and less Greek. That is why we believe that Shakespeare was illiterate. But that is not the case. Probably Jonson was a little jealous of Shakespeare, and he wrote that because of that. And there is, in all likelihood, William Shakespeare had as much Latin education as any educated person of those days. Okay. Then this is Shakespeare wrote, a total of 37 plays, 154 sonnets, at least 2 long poems. Actually, there are more. Then you have, sonnet. His sonnets were published during his lifetime. His long poems also were published during his lifetime, but his plays were not published during his lifetime. They were published, but in a secret way. You have pirated plays coming up. So earlier reference to Shakespeare, Greene, and then you have Francis Mears in a work named Paladis Tamia, or Wit's Treasury. There is a reference to Shakespeare's plays. That is the importance of Francis Mears and Paladis Tamia. Okay, and we have, when Shakespeare was alive, he did not publish any of his work. There was a reason for that, because in those days, the script of the play was not owned by the writer. There was no copyright rules. It was owned by the theatre producer. So this would be sold to the producer. He would, run the play many, many times, and then probably the script would be lost. There was no big practice of having the script of a drama published at that time. So the first folio, or the first authorized collection of Shakespeare's plays happened only in 1623. Shakespeare, as I said, was a playwright. He had shares in theater companies. He was a businessman, a very successful businessman, and he invested in real estate. He also acted in many plays. We do not know the roles he played, but he was a regular actor, not only in his plays, in the plays written by other playwrights also. Shakespeare have acted. So all that we know. The Globe Theatre, which Shakespeare had a big share in, was built in 1598 on the shore of the Thames River, 1598. And later on, two times these theaters, this Globe Theatre was burned down. There were accidents and the theaters were burned down. And later on, the theaters were all closed permanently. That happened in the next century. In 1649, a new dispensation came in England, and all the theaters were closed. So that was the end of actually a big era of theatre in England, English history. So the period from the time Shakespeare was writing, at the time Marlowe, Kidd, Green, Nash, etc. were writing, up to Ben Jonson and later Bowman, Fletcher and others, up to about 1649, it was a period of theatre in England. So many theatre companies were working and a lot of activities were happening. But then, unfortunately, the theatres were closed, and new kind of administration came in England, and the period of the great age of drama ended. And after that, perhaps the big age of drama happened only in the 20th century. Even today, there are many important theatres in London, in America, etc., where dramas are performed on a daily basis. And only at present, because of the COVID thing, I think most of them are closed. And the closing of the theatres used to happen in Shakespeare's time also, because whenever plague came, there was an outbreak of plague, the theatres would be closed. Because people, even then, even though they did not know the exact pathogen that caused the virus, the disease, they knew that it was not good to have gatherings. So they would close down theatres when plague came. Okay, there's Globe Theatre. And in Shakespeare's time, as I was telling you, was a very difficult time. The laws were very not very impartial, and you could get into all kinds of trouble. So very often artists associated themselves with some rich patron who will protect them. So Shakespeare and his group of players were associated. They were known as the Lord Chamberlain's men. They were known as the Lord Chamberlain's men. And when Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 and the new king came, King James I, Shakespeare's theatre company became known as the King's Company. So they became the King's Men. And very interesting bit of information here is Elizabeth passed away in 1603, and as she was not married, there was nobody to take over. And her cousin Mary, you will remember, Mary of Scots, who had her head cut off, had a son. Her son's name was James. James was the King of Scotland at that time. He was James VI of Scotland. And when Elizabeth died, the people invited James VI of Scotland to come and become the King of England also. So he became James I of England, because that was the first time in history that England was having a king with the name James. That is why he is called James I. So he was James I of England and James VI of Scotland. At the same time, he was the ruler of both countries. And paradoxically, his mother was beheaded by his predecessor, Elizabeth. In around 1610, we believe that Shakespeare retired from the theatre business, and he probably returned to England, to his hometown in Stratford. We know that on April 23rd, 1616, he died in Stratford upon Avon at the age of 52. In those days, 52 was a very good age to live up to. People died very young. The average life expectancy must have been around 30 years in those days, maximum. So to live up to 52 was like living up to 80 today, or 80 or 90 today. So we can say that Shakespeare lived to a grand age of 52 when he passed away. So all these things are relative. You will see that. We know that Keats, for example, died when he was 24. He had left behind an immense collection of poetry already. Today, at 24, a person will be still a student. So you see how it is. This is the Globe Theatre today, you see this Globe Theatre on the bank of the River Thames today. It is not in the exact location where Shakespeare's Globe was situated, but not very far. So in the 1980s, evidence of the old theatre was discovered by archaeologists on the shore of River Thames very recently. We are talking about 1980s, when I was still alive. Many of you also might have been alive at that time. So 80s, evidence of the Globe Theatre was found, and they constructed a new Globe Theatre in London in 1997. So this is the present Globe Theatre, built exactly like the theatres of Shakespeare's time. And you can go in and take tickets and watch plays within this theatre. And you would want to know how the theatres of those days looked like. This is how the theatre looked in those days. This is the same Globe Theatre, but a cross section. You see, the stage. The stage protrudes like this. It's a platform that protrudes, and people would stand on all sides. This is a stage, and there will be curtains here, so that people won't be see what happens under the stage. Sometimes actors will crawl in under the stage and come up here on the platform. This number 10 is a trap door. So when you want to show a devil coming up, they would come up from this trap door. This is a very simple structure. The flag is there. The flag means a play is going on. When the play starts, they will have a flag on top. So it's just a simple platform that projected out like that. And people will sit here in this ground and watch. So they would pay a penny to watch a play standing in this ground. So this is a cross section. People would stand around, and if you pay an additional penny, you can borrow a cushion on which you can sit. So people will be sitting around and watching, and they will be standing very close to the actors. See, here you can see this closer picture. This is the stage. The actors are here, and people stand very close like this. See, they can actually touch the actors if they want. So they'll be standing around, and you see there's a curtain here because the lower part of the theatre is hidden, because actors might creep up and then come up on the stage using a trap door if they wanted to show that. And here there is a curtain. This is the inner stage. So this would if you want to show the inside of a house or inside of a castle, etc., this curtain will be drawn and you will see people inside. So this is like that. And also there is an upper stage here. This would be formed if you want to show somebody in the upper story of the building, where Juliet is sitting inside the upper story of the building. Juliet will appear here, and Romeo would stand on the floor here. And in Hamlet's play, there is this castle wall, people will stand here, the soldiers will stand here, and you will feel they are standing on the top of a fort. So that is how the theatre of Shakespeare was arranged. And most of the people were on the ground, but there were also galleries like this. On the side around, there were galleries where wealthier people would be sitting here. And this, yeah. See, you can see these galleries here on the side, and there will be different qualities. There will be personal galleries where a person and his family alone can sit. So many kind of provisions were made. So theatre was a complex kind of construction with many types of facilities for different kinds of viewers. So ordinary people would stand around. They were called the groundlings. Sometimes even high noble men would come to watch, and they will occupy one of the boxes here above. So this is a modern theatre. You see how it is. People would be sitting all around, like in the galleries, in the stage, etc. But there will be a single frame here. It's like a picture frame. Once the curtain rises, then everything happens inside. It is not like Shakespeare's stage where the actors and the the audience were very close. Here, everything happens within the stage. This is called a, see here, the people are standing very close. In the modern stage, that is not the case. There's a picture frame kind of thing, and everything happens behind that. This is a modern theatre. So the stage had no curtain. There was no picture frame as in modern theatres. But there was elaborate costume. People had costumes, and trapdoors were there, and sometimes guns would be fired for the effect of war. Music was there. There was an orchestra who would sit and play music. And the stage was open, as we saw. So there was absolutely no scenery. There is no scenery, no stage property. So for even if it's a battlefield, if it is the front of a house, if it is a castle, if it is a prison, whatever it is, all will be the same. There will be no particular stage properties. And that made the drama, so only if you know that, you will understand many aspects of Shakespeare's plays. For example, there is a lot of description about about what is happening around in Shakespeare's plays. That is because there is no stage decoration. So you have to say, for example, in Hamlet's beginning, there are a couple of people standing guard, and another person comes. It is bitter cold, and I am sick at heart, somebody says. So from the conversation, you understand it is a very cold night, and somebody is standing guard, and some unfortunate events are kind of happening in the country, etc. So all suggested by the description and by the dialogue that is spoken. So because of the lack of stage property, the dramatists have to create all those things using the dialogue. So there were no women actors during Shakespeare's time. It is young boys whose sound was which still more or less like a woman would sing and act in Shakespeare's plays. So you have Lady Macbeth, you have Portia, you have Lady Olivia, many characters, Ophelia, Julius Caesar's wife, Antony and the Cleopatra and Antony and Cleopatra, all these very strong women characters. Shakespeare has many strong women characters. All these women were acted by boys, very young men, or a little adolescent boys whose voice was still like a woman's voice. Probably at the Shakespeare's time there were some very good boy actors who could play these roles. That is why Shakespeare had such interesting characters in his plays. So as we know today, sometimes people will write a screenplay with Mammootty in mind, or with Shobana in mind, or with Jayaram in mind. In the same way, Shakespeare also wrote his plays keeping the actors available in his time in mind. Okay. So the plays were enacted only once, and that will be in the afternoon when there was still daylight. Artificial lighting was not there. And if it rained, people would get wet. Even the actors would sometimes get wet. And there is the weather, the climate. It may be a pleasant afternoon, but if we want to create thunder or lightning and gloominess, all that has to be done through the description of the characters. The characters will be talking about all that. For example, if you read Macbeth, there are 40 speeches which describes the time, which describes the season of the time, and how the weather is, etc. So the stage influences the script of the drama a lot. Okay. Well, playwrights were practical men. What is meant is that they did not write because they were inspired by great poetic urge, but they wrote because they wanted to make a living. So Shakespeare wrote plays not because he wanted us to sit and learn or discuss him for 500 years later. He wrote because he wanted to make a living. And he did make a living out of plays too. He became a very rich man, as we said. In those days, plays were written to be acted, not read. Senecan plays we talked about, Senecan plays, the plays of Seneca, they were written mostly to be read, and they were very difficult to act also. So such plays which are not meant to be acted are also there. For example, later on, Samson Agonistes, there is a play written by Milton, and Shelley wrote a play named Chenji. All these are plays that were meant to be read and not acted. But in Shakespeare's time, or the Elizabethan time saw the greatest flowering of drama in England, as I said. Plays were written to be acted. That is why we don't have many of them in print. And maybe it is believed that a large number of plays were written and acted in those days, thousands of them. But we have only maybe around 1,000 or less than that plays remaining by all the writers of the time. So much of the plays were lost. And we say that Shakespeare has written 37 plays, but it is possible that he wrote more. We do not know. The research is still going on, and people may come up with another play written by Shakespeare at some point of time. There are some people who still say that he has written 38 plays. We do not know. There were many collaborations where Shakespeare wrote along with another playwright. All those things were possible. And the playwright would sell his manuscript to the theatre owner, and then he had no personal right on it. But in Shakespeare's time, very often he was the producer, and he was also the writer. And as we said, theatres were active only in the evenings. The plays would be enacted only in the evening. In the daytime, sometimes, evening means when there still was light, not very late in the evening, in the afternoon, I would say. But in the morning time, when people would go to the market, etc., there may be other entertainments like cockfighting, bull baiting, bear baiting, etc., happening in the. You might know all these things, or if you do not know, please find out what bear baiting is. Very cruel kind of entertainment, but those were the days when people liked such things. And this is the theatre, and this is the stage and things. Modern theatre, I told you. And modern. Now we come to the Shakespeare publication, quartos and folios. See, I said to talk about the size. This big book is a folio. This small one is the quarto size. This is a contrast of the size. And quartos were, it meant quarter, the size of the paper. Paper folded 4 times, and one bit is a quarter. Just as we have A4, A3 and A5 now. So this folio is the bigger one, and the quarto is the smaller one. That is one information you need to keep in mind. And what were the quartos? When Shakespeare was still alive, he never authorized the publication of any of his drama, because the drama was meant to be acted. When he was still alive itself, there were unauthorized printing of his works. For example, this is one side, the history of Henry IV, etc., etc. It's an unauthorized printing of Shakespeare's work when he was still alive. How will they do that? They could never get the copy, because the copy will be fiercely guarded by the theatre producer. So people who watch drama might reproduce the drama from their memory, and sometimes people would write down the drama while they sit in the theatre. Just like using a camera, people take a print from the theatre movies today. They used to write this secretly down, and sometimes they'll get foul copies. Foul copies is a drafts that the writer makes. They are not foul. They are called foul copy because they are the drafts that the playwright make. From all these things, they would create a pirated version of the play. A pirated version is an unauthorized version. So you have a pirated book, means unauthorized book. In Trivandrum, near the university, near the public library, etc., there are places selling second-hand books. They also sell unauthorized copies of books. So if you take, you will know the quality will not be very good. Just like movies are pirated, unauthorized copies of a movie is a pirated movie. The unauthorized printing of a book is an act of piracy also. So these quartos were the books. When we talk about Shakespeare and quartos are all unauthorized printed version of his plays that came out during his lifetime. And those are the quartos. And among the quartos, there are good quartos and bad quartos, in the sense with a lot of printing mistake, lot of errors, is a bad quarto. And if there is some level of, what shall we say, clarity in terms of spelling and other things, it is called a good quarto. Legible kind of printing in those days spelling system was very poor, as I said. So those are good quartos and bad quartos. And in 1623, several years after Shakespeare died, 4, 5, 6, 7 years after Shakespeare died, two of his friends, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, published a volume of books. This had 36 of his plays. Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories and Tragedies, published according to the true original copies. So we do not know whether they got this true original copy, etc. So this is the picture of Shakespeare that appears in that book. Okay, that is about the quarto. Folio is the folio again is the size of the book. So the first folio is the complete works of Shakespeare, published in 1623, edited by John Hemmings and Henry Condell. So that is about quartos, folios. So these quartos, I said there are bad quartos, good quartos, etc. But whether bad or good, people have put together all the available material, all the quarto, all the books that have remained from the quarto series and in the first folio, second folio. And Shakespeare scholars have created modern editions of Shakespeare based on all these things, because none of these quartos, even the folio that is printed by Hemmings and Condell, are complete and perfect. So Shakespeare scholars work a lot, and they create modern editions of Hamlet or Macbeth or whatever based on all these available material. So that is the information on quartos and folios. Now we will go for a classification of Shakespeare's drama. As we said, Shakespeare has about 37 plays or 38 plays, and we generally classify them in many ways. In the study material, there is a classification. You have a list of all the plays. Here, this is another popular way of classifying his plays. Those plays belonging to the first period, that is from when Shakespeare was 26 to 30 years old, that is the apprenticeship period. Those are rather immature early plays, like Henry VI plays and Troilus and Cressida, all must belong to those early time. The second period is supposed to be the period when he has kind of mastered his art, and the most popular works in that time was the romantic comedies. Romantic comedies, we'll talk about romantic comedies, like comedies like As You Like It, Twelfth Night, etc. are romantic comedies. Then the third period, we believe that when Shakespeare was living in London, there was some difficulties in his life. We do not know exactly what difficulty it is, but it is generally believed that it involved a woman and a relationship he had. And maybe other issues were also there, financial or litigation, etc. might have been there. Litigation is related to cases in the court. So the third period, when it is believed that Shakespeare was troubled a lot in that time, and plays like Hamlet was written at that time, very bitter play. Macbeth, again another very bitter play. And even the comedies that were written at that time were very bitter, like Winter's Tale, like All's Well That Ends Well, Measure for Measure. All those were troubled times when Shakespeare deals with the problem of evil in the world. And it is generally believed that his life itself was going through some difficult times in that period. In the fourth period, Shakespeare writes a more mature kind of plays. They are classified as tragicomedies, or they are called dramatic romances. They have all the potential for a tragedy, but they end up not being tragic. So they are another category of plays. Now, early comedies, which belong to the earliest half of his career, the plots are not very original. He adapted existing plays, probably. The characters not very perfected. The style is again still a bit immature. He does a lot of word play and quibbling. Quibbling is playing with words. Like Shakespeare is supposed to be a very not supposed. Shakespeare liked playing with words a lot. For example, in in the early part of Julius Caesar that somebody says that I am a mender of bad souls. I am a mender of bad souls. He means that SOLE, soul. Soul is the sole of a chapel or a shoe. So he's a cobbler. He's a cobbler. A mender of bad souls. When you hear if it is SOUL, it would be a priest. So he's playing with the word. I am a mender of bad souls, because SOLE and SOUL have the same pronunciation. That's an example for quibbling. Throughout Shakespeare's plays, you will find word plays like this. Another example would be from the beginning lines of Richard III, where Shakespeare says, now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. The son of York. York is a reference to the family of York in the Battle of Roses. So S-U-N son and S-O-N son. Son of York means a young king belonging to the York family. The son of York means a bright hope that we have from the York family. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. So play with words. You have it throughout. But here in this early plays, we find it a little more. So there is a lot of wordplay. When that happens too much, it creates a lot of comedy, but still you might not be amused all the time. And that is why later Dr. Samuel Johnson, not Ben Jonson, Samuel Johnson talked about like a quibble was to Shakespeare a fatal Cleopatra for whom he lost the world and was content to lose it. Well, when you study Antony and Cleopatra, you will find out how to Antony, Cleopatra was a fatal person. Cleopatra was deadly to him, because if he had not met Cleopatra, Antony would have, wouldn't have the present reputation he has. Antony was a very strong person. Antony was a powerful military leader. He was much respected by the Romans, but he declined and fell from all that position because of his infatuation for Cleopatra. So Antony lost the world for Cleopatra, but he was only happy to do it. He did not, if he had an option between the world and Cleopatra, he would always choose Cleopatra. And the same way, Dr. Johnson says, if Shakespeare had the choice between winning the world and quibbling, he would opt to quibble. But, well, that was Johnson's personal opinion. No harm has come to Shakespeare because of his quibbling. Okay. Well, I was just explaining what wordplay and quibbling is. Playing with words. So in the early comedies, you will find a lot of examples for that. And these three plays belong to the early comedies. These are not all, but I've just given three examples here. The Comedy of Errors, Love's Labour's Lost, Two Gentlemen of Verona are all examples of early comedy. You will note that these books are never prescribed for study in college courses or programs, because they are not considered the very best of Shakespeare. Then there is another category of plays called English history plays, which are 10 in number. As I said, I have two videos on this, short videos, 15 minutes each, which you can watch and learn more about it. I am not spending time on history plays now. English history plays. Then you have mature comedies. This belongs to his mature years. So very, very happy comedies. Much Ado About Nothing. Very hilarious works these are. Much Ado About Nothing is a very hilarious comedy. Okay. Much Ado About Nothing. Twelfth Night. Merchant of Venice, As You Like It are all examples for his mature comedies. And these are also sometimes called romantic comedies. And in these plays, women characters are more prominent than men characters. You for example, in Much Ado About Nothing, Beatrice, and Twelfth Night, Lady Olivia and Viola, Merchant of Venice, Portia, As You Like It. I forgot the name of the lady, the girls there in the Forest of Arden. All these are you will be studying As You Like It in the afternoon. So it's the teacher will tell you it's a romantic comedy, and she'll tell you why it is a romantic comedy. Okay, As You Like It. These are all very bright comedy. Their mature comic genius is there, sophisticated wit is there, jovial good humor, vitality, warm humanity, and a lot of use of prose are features of mature comedies. Then you have, as I said, the gloomy period in his time when he wrote problem plays. They are called problem plays. They are also called dark comedies. They have a happy ending, but they are very generally tragic in tone. They are somber, tragic, cynical, a kind of disillusion with life is there. All those things are there. Many objectionable characters are there. It is believed that Shakespeare had was rather unhappy with some sexual experience he had. Maybe he fell in love with a prostitute. We do not know. But generally, it is believed that Shakespeare had a sex nausea at this time. He was kind of repulsed and attracted by sex and women at the same time, and that kind of a feeling can be found in the comedies at that time. That is there in Hamlet also. When you study Hamlet, look out for his nausea towards man-woman relationship. All is well that ends well, Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida. All these are examples for problem plays. Okay. And then we have this category called the Great Tragedies, which is the apotheosis of his work, the most what shall we say, respected of Shakespeare's plays are Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. In his psychological insight and this versification and all kinds of craftsmanship, these plays are very, very intact. But again, in all these plays, the outlook to life is very, very gloomy. Yeah. You have another set of plays, particularly three of them: Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus, which belong to the category called the Roman plays. They are called the Roman plays. And he drew inspiration from the book named Lives. This is actually Lives. I'll tell you more about it. So these are called the Roman plays. And then in the last part of his life, he had a kind of writing. They are called the romances. They are also called tragicomedies sometimes. Example would be Cymbeline, Winter's Tale, The Tempest, Pericles. And The Tempest is believed to be the very last play that Shakespeare wrote. It is said to be believed to be his goodbye play. So that is about his final plays. And you'll remember that I told you about the three unities. The Greek plays, the Greek drama, written by Sophocles, Aristophanes, Euripides, etc., followed the three unities. It means if you write a tragedy, the whole play will be tragic. And the play will cover only about 3 hours duration. A play will take about 3 hours to stage, and the action will also cover only about 3 hours. That is the unity of time. The other was unity of action. Where it is tragedy, it will be entirely tragic. If it is comedy, it is entirely comic. That is the unity of action. And also, the whole play will happen in an area that can be covered within 3 hours. So you won't have something happening in Trivandrum in the beginning and in Delhi in the end, because you cannot travel from Trivandrum to Delhi in 3 hours' time. So in those plays, if it is in Trivandrum, mostly the action will happen only in Trivandrum. If it is in Ernakulam, it will happen only in Ernakulam. So maybe in those places it will be Athens or Sparta or some places like that. So that is unity of space. So there were 3 unities: unities of time, unity of place, unity of action. Unity of time means the play will cover only that much time that will happen in about 3 hours. unity of action means if it is tragedy, it's only tragedy. And unity of time is unity of places. The area covered, geographical area covered in the play will be a limited one. This is it. And when Aristotle wrote his Poetics, he described that this is how the Greeks wrote their play. He observed that in the plays of Sophocles, Aristophanes, Euripides, etc., there was 3 unities. And later, the Italian theorists made rules out of it. So they said that a play should have these unities. Aristotle did not say a play should have, he said plays have. He was describing. And later, Italian scholars or Latin scholars, they insisted that plays should follow these 3 things. So in those age, when Shakespeare began to write, there was a general criticism of his plays that he did not keep these 3 unities. For example, in The Winter's Tale, the first half ends and then the second half begins after about 18 years, roughly 18 or 14 years. When the baby in the first half is a grown young lady in the second half. So that kind of, the unity of time is not kept. And in many plays, including the play you're going to study on the 24th, sometimes action will be in Egypt and sometimes it will be in Rome. So you can't be in Egypt and Rome within 3 hours' time. But Shakespeare shows that. It is actually perfectly okay to do it, but at that time Shakespeare was criticized by many for not keeping the 3 unities. That is something you will be discussing again perhaps. So in the last play that Shakespeare wrote, he has kept all the 3 unities. The whole thing happens within an island and within about 3 to 4 hours time, and it is throughout it is the same kind of action. There is no extreme sorrow or no extreme happiness. The last plays are called romances. Remember the word romance in those days, and in the way we use it in literature, doesn't always mean having love and love affair in it. Romances are rather fanciful works. So he has also written 154 sonnets, and then he has these 4 long poems: Venus and Adonis, Rape of Lucrece, Phoenix and the Turtle, and The Lover's Complaint. These were published when he was alive, and he was very popular as a writer of long poems. His sonnets were also published when he was living. And the theme in these plays are love, broken trust of a friend, love, loss of love, forgiveness, a dark lady, a rival poet. All those things repeatedly occur in the sonnets. I think that has already been covered, or your teacher will be discussing it in the afternoon today. And my final slide is on the sources of Shakespeare. Now, we must remember that Shakespeare did not create, except for Tempest and maybe 1 or 2 other plays, most of the plot, the story of his work were taken from some other source. Shakespeare did not imagine, Shakespeare's plays are not entirely his creation. The story might already have been there. For example, the King Lear story was already there. Story of Coriolanus was already there. Hamlet was already there. All these were existing plays, existing stories or existing plays which he transformed into, to use his own words, something rich and strange. So you need to have a good idea of Shakespeare's sources. It means from where did Shakespeare get these the stories that he converted into plays. Shakespeare's English history plays, which are 10 in number, as I said, have been taken from Holinshed's. Holinshed is the name of a man. Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland. There is a book named Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland, written by a man named Holinshed, and that is a history book, and that became the source to most of Shakespeare's history plays, English history plays. from King John down to Henry VIII. Shakespeare has a play named Henry VIII, the story of Elizabeth's father, and I think it was produced after Elizabeth's death. It was one of his last plays. Anyway, that is one of the sources. But that not just that, there were also a couple of other books that Shakespeare used for his history plays. But Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland. It is generally known as Holinshed's Chronicles. So for the exam, you need to write only Holinshed's Chronicles. But I'm just telling you that this is the full name. Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, written by Holinshed. And then there is another book named Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, which is popularly known as Plutarch's Lives. So we call it Plutarch's Lives, but actually it is a book named Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, written by a gentleman, an Italian named Plutarch. And that was translated in English by a man named Thomas North. Thomas North's English language translation of Plutarch's Lives was the source for Shakespeare's Roman plays, Coriolanus, Antony and Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar. And there were also many existing plays that Shakespeare took and recast. There were existing stories that Shakespeare borrowed and made into plays. He has taken parts or stories from Boccaccio, from Ovid, from Seneca, Plautus, many writers. In those days, there was no rule about you should create your own story. You can also say that the plays produced by early Greek tragedians like Sophocles. So Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus also created plays out of existing stories. Medea or Hippolyta, Oedipus. These are all stories that people knew. So people would want to know how that particular author is going to present that story. So in those days, the novelty of the story was not a big deal. It is the novelty of the presentation that fascinated people. So that is generally about Shakespeare's works.